You know him from some of the biggest movies on the planet, but Chris Pratt has also become famous for something else, being really outspoken about his Christian faith. So today, we're going to dive into the whole conversation and the controversy that's been sparked by what he says publicly. We're going to break down a really important speech he gave, his unique strategy for dealing with the media, and what it all tells us about the tricky mix of fame and faith.
Okay, so it all kind of kicked off at the MTV Awards. Not exactly where you'd expect to hear a sermon, right? Instead of the usual, "I'd like to thank my agent," Pratt gets up and delivers this incredibly direct message of faith. This one quote, man, it just became the launchpad for a massive public debate about his beliefs and where he fits in Hollywood. So let's really break down that speech and figure out why it struck such a nerve. See, this wasn't just a simple "God bless" at the end of a thank you. No, this was a detailed declaration of his beliefs, and he presented it as actual life advice for a young audience.
He called them his 9 rules, and they covered some pretty deep stuff. We're talking everything from finding your purpose and grace to the importance of prayer. You can see the key highlights here. It was, for all intents and purposes, a mini-sermon, a very personal, very structured set of beliefs shared on one of the biggest stages in pop culture.
But here's the thing, being that open about your faith, especially with a message that's so distinctly Christian, well, that's just not standard operating procedure in Hollywood. And that's where this whole conversation starts to get really complicated. So you have to ask, why did this one speech generate so much heat, especially in an industry that's supposedly built on celebrating diverse voices? Well, the source material we're looking at today points directly to the unique cultural environment of the entertainment industry itself. The commentator we're drawing from argues that there are these unwritten rules. You know, a general mention of God might be acceptable, but when you start using explicitly Christian language, that can be seen as crossing a line that could potentially get an actor sort of pushed to the margins. So from this point of view, Pratt's speech wasn't just him being heartfelt. It was a seriously risky career move.
And that perceived risk leads us straight into this idea of a media minefield. How does Chris Pratt himself deal with all the criticism? Well, he's actually spoken very openly about how challenging it is to have a public story created about you, whether it's true or not.
Pratt talks about this huge gap between who he actually is and this public persona that's been crafted by some media outlets. He basically sees that public story as a kind of pure fiction that's being sold as reality to millions and millions of people. So how in the world does he handle that? He turns to some ancient wisdom, and specifically this proverb. This one verse is the entire foundation of his media strategy, and honestly, it's surprisingly simple. His whole strategy is just this: don't fuel the fire. Pratt believes that if he responds to every negative story or every angry tweet, all he's doing is giving it more oxygen, more attention, and making the audience for it bigger. So by refusing to add more wood to that fire, he figures he's starving the controversy of the very thing it needs to survive.
Now, the source material we analyze connects this whole media environment to our super intense political climate. And to explain the kind of backlash some public figures get, the commentator uses the term Trump derangement syndrome. They define it as this incredibly negative, almost allergic reaction where any perceived connection to a political figure is just automatically rejected. This, they argue, creates a really difficult landscape for anyone in the public eye.
Okay, but let's shift away from all the public perception and talk about the man himself. In a really candid interview, Pratt actually detailed his own spiritual journey. And you know what? It's a lot more nuanced than a lot of people might assume.
To explain his perspective, Pratt gave his own little history lesson on the Protestant Reformation. He talked about how Mass used to be in Latin, a language most people couldn't understand. Then, the Gutenberg printing press came along and changed everything. Bibles became way more accessible, and people could actually read it for themselves instead of just relying on a priest's interpretation. For him, this huge historical shift is the key to understanding why there are so many different Christian denominations today.
And you can totally see how that historical view informs his own kind of fluid faith identity. His roots are Catholic, he was baptized Catholic, his wife is Catholic, and he still goes to a Catholic church with his family. He's even collaborated with Catholic organizations. And yet, he doesn't really feel the need to stick to one single label. At the end of the day, when he's asked to define his beliefs, this is what he says: simple, direct. For Pratt, this statement seems to cut through all the labels, all the different denominations, and it just boils his entire identity down to that one core relationship.
So what's the final takeaway from our source material? Well, the commentator brings it all together with one last analysis on what it really means to be a person of faith in the modern entertainment industry. And the commentator's final take is pretty unambiguous.
They believe that Hollywood's core culture is fundamentally at odds with traditional Christian faith. And in that view, what Chris Pratt is doing isn't just speaking his mind, it's an act of defiance against a powerful cultural norm.
And so here are the concluding thoughts from that analysis. The commentator says they appreciate Pratt's willingness to use his platform the way he does. They believe that public figures of faith face what they call wickedness every single day, and they end with a call for their audience to offer spiritual support and to keep people like him lifted up in prayer.
This really leaves us with a much broader question, one that goes way beyond just one celebrity. In an age of such intense public scrutiny, how should anyone navigate sharing their deepest beliefs? Is it better to just stay silent, or do you speak out, knowing all the risks that come with it? It's a question with no easy answers. Thanks for joining us.